For much of its history, Vietnam existed within China's political and cultural sphere of influence. During the 19th century, France expanded its influence into the region and eventually laid claim to it as part of its colonial ambitions. The French maintained their presence in Vietnam until World War II. After Nazi Germany occupied France, Japan expanded its military campaign in East Asia, took control of large areas of China, and eventually displaced French authority in Vietnam. At the same time, a Vietnamese revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh emerged as a leading figure in the resistance against the Japanese occupation. Ho Chi Minh was a committed communist. Following Japan's defeat at the end of World War II, Ho Chi Minh consolidated power in Vietnam and declared the establishment of a communist state, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. From that year until 1950, over a period of 5 years, the communist government grew significantly, and the Americans were strongly opposed to it. By this time, Communist China had emerged as a major power, while the Soviet Union was already the world's leading communist state. Together, they provided strong political, economic, and military support to countries and movements pursuing communist revolutions. Ho Chi Minh was no longer able to maintain control over the entirety of Vietnam, and French forces returned, reasserting their authority in the southern part of the country. From this period onward, Vietnam became divided. South Vietnam aligned with and received support from Western countries, while North Vietnam, under Ho Chi Minh, was backed by Communist China and the Soviet Union. To counter the influence of communism, Western-backed authorities supported the anti-communist Vietnamese leader, Bao Dai, and placed him in charge of the government in South Vietnam. By 1953, the war between French forces and North Vietnam had escalated significantly. President Dwight Eisenhower feared that if France lost its position in South Vietnam, the region could ultimately come under communist rule. In 1954, Vietnam's partition became official. Similar to what had occurred on the Korean Peninsula, the country was divided into two separate entities, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Western-backed authorities supported Ngo Dinh Diem's appointment as Prime Minister of South Vietnam. At the same time, the communist movement in North Vietnam continued to expand and consolidate its power. With Western backing, the southern region was established as a separate state, known as the Republic of Vietnam, with Saigon chosen as its capital city. The Western-backed division of the country was met with strong opposition from the North Vietnamese, and the resulting conflict plunged the region into prolonged instability and warfare. In 1955, armed conflict between North and South Vietnam was already underway, though it was still largely regional and had not yet escalated into a fully generalized war. By 1960, North Vietnam had begun supplying weapons to communist groups operating in South Vietnam, helping to strengthen the insurgency in the South. These communist guerrilla fighters operating in South Vietnam became known as the Viet Cong. What does Viet Cong mean? The term was commonly used by anti-communist South Vietnamese to describe the communist insurgents operating in the South. Derived from the phrase Vietnamese communist, it was often employed as a pejorative label, suggesting that these fighters were betraying Vietnam in the service of communism. Ho Chi Minh supplied weapons to the South through the Viet Cong, using the dense jungles of Vietnam and routes running through Laos and Cambodia. The Viet Cong established a presence in many of the poorer regions of South Vietnam, where they sought to recruit support and persuade local communities to take part in the insurgency. As the war between North and South Vietnam continued into 1963, President John F. Kennedy watched events unfold with growing concern as the conflict increasingly drew the attention of the United States. Having witnessed the rise of a communist government in Cuba, Kennedy was determined to prevent a similar outcome in Vietnam. Initially, the United States increased its support for South Vietnam by supplying money, weapons, and military assistance. Although most people in South Vietnam were Buddhist, the government, whose roots lay in the French-backed political order, was led largely by Catholics. Accusations of discrimination against Buddhists fueled public discontent and became a significant source of instability within South Vietnam. As the crisis in Vietnam continued to deepen and the United States debated its next steps, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Following his death, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency. Johnson authorized the deployment of experienced CIA personnel and advisors to South Vietnam, where they assisted in training local military forces and strengthening their ability to fight the insurgency. Off the coast of Vietnam lies a body of water known as the Gulf of Tonkin. The commander of the American destroyer ordered a counterattack, and the Vietnamese boats were destroyed. In the aftermath of the incident, President Johnson used the event as a basis for dramatically expanding U.S. military action against North Vietnam. 2 days later, the bombing campaign against North Vietnam began, carried out by B-52 bombers, capable of dropping massive quantities of bombs over wide areas. By 1965, with the United States now deeply involved in the war, young American men were required to register for the draft and could be called up for military service in Vietnam. As the conflict intensified, it soon evolved into a prolonged war of attrition. Viet Cong guerrilla fighters frequently infiltrated South Vietnam, launched hit-and-run attacks, and then retreated before larger forces could respond. Among the most controversial weapons used by the U.S. military during the Vietnam War were napalm bombs, which were deployed in bombing operations across parts of Vietnam. Since many Vietnamese guerrilla fighters operated from within dense jungle environments, napalm was used to set vast areas of vegetation ablaze, depriving them of cover and exposing those hiding in the forests. The United States equipped and deployed more than 200,000 troops to South Vietnam to fight against the Viet Cong. Vietnam's geography made it difficult for the war to unfold the way the United States had hoped. Despite deploying some of its most advanced military equipment, the U.S. continued to struggle to achieve its objectives. The Viet Cong relied heavily on guerrilla warfare tactics. They would launch sudden attacks and then melt back into the jungle, using dense vegetation as cover. They set up ambushes and operated from vast underground tunnel systems, allowing them to move, communicate, and resupply while avoiding direct confrontation with American forces. Most importantly, the Viet Cong knew the terrain extremely well, whereas American troops were often unfamiliar with the area. As a result, the United States struggled to locate and defeat them. The war did not progress decisively in favor of either side, as the United States had superior military equipment, while the Viet Cong had strong knowledge of the terrain. In addition, many Vietnamese people were not strongly opposed to communism. In 1968, the Viet Cong assembled a force of approximately 68,000 troops and carried out a major offensive against South Vietnam. The offensive reached the city of Hue, where the advance was stopped, leading to heavy and prolonged fighting that lasted for roughly a month. In the 1968 U.S. presidential election, Richard Nixon emerged victorious, succeeding Lyndon B. Johnson as president. Over time, Nixon recognized the growing anti-war sentiment among the American public, and as a result, he initiated the gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam. It was during this period that Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam, passed away at the age of 79. Even as U.S. ground forces were gradually withdrawn, the aerial bombing campaign continued at full intensity. Daily airstrikes were conducted over North Vietnam and extended into Laos and Cambodia. In 1973, they decided to effectively divide Vietnam, similar to Korea, in order to bring an end to the war. They agreed that all foreign forces would be withdrawn from both North and South Vietnam, ending the conflict. The peace negotiations were conducted by Henry Kissinger on behalf of the United States and Lee Duc Tho on behalf of North Vietnam. As a result of their efforts, both men were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Henry Kissinger accepted the award with pride, but Lee Duc Tho refused to accept it, arguing that Vietnam had been devastated by the war and that genuine peace had not yet been achieved. In 1974, the Watergate scandal culminated in Richard Nixon's resignation, making him the first U.S. president to step down from office. When North Vietnam saw that the United States was distracted by domestic problems, it quickly moved into South Vietnam, aided by support from many South Vietnamese who favored the creation of a communist government. In less than a year, North Vietnamese forces advanced all the way to Saigon, ultimately capturing the city and bringing the war to its final stage. As North Vietnamese forces reached the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, they surrounded the area. Embassy personnel were forced to evacuate by climbing to the rooftop, where helicopters awaited to fly them out of the city. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnam completely overran South Vietnam, and the entire country was eventually unified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The city of Saigon was later renamed Ho Chi Minh City in honor of the late North Vietnamese leader. In the end, Vietnam was reunified under a communist government. Decades have passed since then, and Vietnam remains a communist state. While the country has experienced significant economic growth and development in recent decades, debates continue over its political system, economic challenges, and the quality of life of its citizens. The conflict left an estimated 2.5 million people dead, including over 1 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians. The human cost of the war was immense, affecting generations across Vietnam. Thank you for watching this episode of Historic Play. If you enjoy deep dives into history, wars, empires, and the events that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe and join our growing community. Until the next video, this is Historic Play signing off.